The laughter started before he even got the tractor home. Ed Calloway heard it from across the auction yard on a Saturday morning in October of 1999, standing at the cashier's table, writing a check for $4,200. The Massey Ferguson 362 he'd just bought was sitting on a trailer behind a pickup truck that wasn't his yet. He'd have to come back for it with his own truck and a borrowed trailer, and the two men laughing were close enough that he didn't have to strain to hear what they were saying. That's Calloway. He just paid good money for that thing. The second voice, what's he going to do with it? Use it for parts? The first voice again, quieter but not quiet enough. He overpaid for parts. Ed finished writing the check. He took his receipt. He walked to his truck without looking at the two men, drove home, borrowed a trailer from his brother-in-law, and went back for the Massey Ferguson that afternoon. He parked it in his equipment shed, shut the shed door, and went inside for dinner. His wife Carol asked how the auction went. Ed said he got what he went for. Carol asked what that was. Ed said, a tractor. Carol asked which one. Ed told her. Carol asked what he paid. Ed told her that too. Carol looked at him for a moment, then said, will it work? Ed said, that's what I'm going to find out. He found out over the following 2 weeks. The Massey Ferguson 362 was a 1987 model with 6,800 hours on it. The previous owner had been a small operation in Fountain County that had upgraded and sold everything in a dispersal auction. The machine had not been babied, but it had not been destroyed either. The hydraulics were functional. The engine ran without smoke. The transmission shifted cleanly through all gears. What it needed was attention. The air filter was clogged. One hydraulic hose was weeping at the fitting. The front axle had a shimmy at road speed that turned out to be a worn tie rod end. Ed replaced the filter, the hose, and the tie rod end over the course of 4 evenings in his shed. Total parts cost $230. Total labor cost nothing because Ed Calloway did his own work. On a Thursday morning in early November, he drove the Massey Ferguson out of the shed and across his field for the first time. It pulled without complaint. The four-wheel drive engaged cleanly. The hydraulics responded correctly. Ed drove back to the shed, shut the engine off, and sat in the cab for a moment. $4,200, $230 in parts, 4 evenings of his own time, and a tractor that worked. He thought about the laughter in the auction yard. He thought about the two men who'd said he overpaid for parts. Then he climbed down, put his tools away, and went inside. He didn't think about it again for a long time. He didn't need to. The tractor worked. That was the answer. The two men who had been laughing at the auction were named Dennis Pruitt and Gary Wills. Ed had known both of them for most of his adult life. They farmed adjacent ground, Dennis to his north, Gary to his east, and had been farming it longer than Ed had been farming his 440 acres in Fountain County, Indiana. They were not bad men. They were the kind of men who exist in every rural county, competent, opinionated, and accustomed to a hierarchy of equipment and acreage that they had positioned themselves comfortably within. Dennis ran 1,200 acres. Gary ran 900. Both of them operated newer equipment, financed through dealer credit, upgraded on a cycle that kept them current and kept them in debt in a ratio they apparently found acceptable. They had opinions about equipment, specific opinions, offered freely, in the way that men who have never been wrong about anything in their own estimation offer opinions. When Ed bought his first Massey Ferguson in 1994, a 3070 that he'd found at a private sale and paid $11,000 for, Dennis had told him at the co-op that he'd regret not buying green. Ed had said he'd keep that in mind. When Ed bought a second Massey Ferguson in 1997 to replace an aging utility tractor, Gary had shaken his head and said something about resale value that Ed had listened to and then disregarded. The 362 was Ed's third Massey Ferguson. By October of 1999, the pattern was established. Ed bought Massey Ferguson. Dennis and Gary expressed skepticism. Ed went back to work. The tractor ran. What had changed by 1999 was the volume of the skepticism. Dennis and Gary had grown comfortable enough in their opinions that they expressed them at auction volume without checking who was within earshot. Ed had been within earshot. He had heard them. and he had written his check and taken his receipt and gone home and done what he always did, which was put the machine to work and let the work speak for itself. The problem with letting work speak for itself is that it requires patience. Real patience. Not the performed patience of someone waiting to be vindicated, but the actual indifference to other people's assessments that comes from knowing what you know and not needing anyone else to confirm it. Ed Calloway had that patience. He had built it across 20 years of farming ground that had required him to make decisions without institutional support, without deep pockets, and without the comfort of equipment that impressed people at the elevator. He had built it through the specific discipline of a man who had learned early that the opinion of the people watching you work is worth exactly nothing compared to the opinion of the ground you're working. Dennis Pruitt and Gary Wills were welcome to their laughter. Ed had a tractor to run. The years that followed were not dramatic. Ed farmed. He planted corn and soybeans across 440 acres, expanded to 580 in 2003, when a neighboring parcel came available at a price he recognized as right, and managed the operation with the tight margin discipline of someone who had never had the luxury of waste. The Massey Ferguson 362 became his primary tillage tractor. He used it for fall chisel plowing, for spring field work, for pulling the planter in conditions that tested traction. It did not distinguish itself by breaking down in spectacular ways or refusing to start in cold weather or developing the kinds of chronic problems that define a bad machine. It distinguished itself by running, season after season, with oil changes on schedule and filters replaced when the hours said to replace them, and grease in the fittings every morning before the day started. By 2005, it had 9,000 hours on it. Ed had rebuilt the hydraulic pump that year, a 3-day job he did himself, referencing the service manual he'd bought in 2001 and kept on the shelf above the workbench. The pump had not failed. He'd caught the wear during an inspection and addressed it before it became a problem, because Ed Calloway's philosophy of maintenance was the philosophy of prevention, which is more expensive in time and cheaper in money than the philosophy of repair. Dennis Pruitt replaced his primary tractor in 2004, a new John Deere 8320, financed over 6 years. The machine cost $112,000. It was impressive on the lot and impressive in the field, and it made the kind of statement that a $112,000 tractor is purchased partly to make. Dennis mentioned it at the co-op in the way that men mention significant purchases, not boasting exactly, but making sure the information was available to anyone who wanted it. Ed said it looked like a good machine. Dennis said it was the best he'd ever run. Ed said he was glad to hear it. He drove home in his truck and went back to the shed and checked the hour meter on the 362 and wrote the next service interval in his notebook. Gary Wills bought a new Case IH Magnum in 2006. Financed. Impressive. Gary mentioned it. Ed said it looked like a good machine. The conversation went the same way it always went. What neither Dennis nor Gary said, what neither of them would have said because it would have required acknowledging something they had committed to not acknowledging, was that Ed Calloway's operation was performing. His yields were county average or above. His land was paid for. His equipment debt was zero. He was not flashy, and he was not expanding aggressively, and he was not running the kind of iron that turned heads at the elevator. He was simply farming, correctly, with machines that worked on ground that was his. The Massey Ferguson 362 crossed 10,000 hours in 2007. Ed noted it in his maintenance log and changed the oil and went back to work. The summer of 2012 was dry. Across Fountain County, the drought that had been building since late spring reached the kind of severity that changes a season's outcome, regardless of what a farmer does in July. Corn that had gone in on time and been managed correctly still struggled. Fields with lighter soils went backward in August. Yield projections that had looked acceptable in June were being revised sharply downward by the time combining started in September. Ed's operation was not exempt. His corn yields fell 31% from the previous year. His soybean yields held better. He'd planted into fields with heavier soils that retained moisture longer. But the season was painful in the way that drought seasons are always painful, which is precisely and financially painful in ways that don't average out easily. He made it through. His land was paid for, which meant his fixed costs were lower than they appeared on paper. His equipment debt was zero, which meant his cash flow could absorb a difficult year without triggering conversations with bankers that he didn't want to have. He sold grain he'd stored from 2011 at prices that partially offset the 2012 shortfall. He did not take on debt to cover the gap. Dennis Pruitt had a harder 2012. The John Deere 8320 he'd bought in 2004 had been replaced in 2010 with a newer model. Another large purchase, another 6-year note, and the combination of the drought year's reduced income and the equipment payment schedule produced a cash flow problem that Dennis mentioned obliquely at the co-op in October. He mentioned it in the way that men mention financial difficulty when they are not ready to call it what it is, as a temporary inconvenience, a bad year, a situation that would resolve itself with a better season. Gary Wills said nothing about his 2012 finances, but Gary had expanded to 1,100 acres in 2008 on borrowed capital, and the drought year's impact on that scale of operation with that level of debt was visible to anyone who was paying attention to what Gary didn't say as much as what he did. Ed Calloway said nothing. He did his accounting, made his adjustments, and waited for the next season. The Massey Ferguson 362 had 11,000 hours on it by fall of 2012. It had spent the summer pulling equipment across ground that was harder than it should have been and had not complained. By 2015, the operation Ed had been building across 16 years had arrived at a stability that he had not planned for explicitly, but had been working toward in every practical decision he'd made since buying his first Massey Ferguson in 1994. His land was paid for. His equipment, the 362, a newer Massey Ferguson 5465 he'd bought used in 2009, and a combine he'd purchased in 2011, carried no debt. His margins were thin in the way that farming margins are always thin, but they were consistent, and consistency in farming is not a small thing. Dennis Pruitt had refinanced his equipment debt twice since 2004. He was running good machines, there was no question about that, but the payment schedule required commodity prices that the market delivered some years and didn't deliver others. And the years it didn't deliver were becoming increasingly difficult to absorb. Gary Wills had sold 80 acres in 2013 to service debt obligations he didn't discuss publicly. He was still farming, still running the Case IH Magnum, still present at the elevator and the co-op and the places where farmers present themselves. But the scale had contracted, and the pressure was visible to anyone who'd been watching long enough. Ed had been watching long enough. He said nothing about it. It wasn't his business what his neighbor's finances looked like. He had his own operation to run, and running it correctly was the only thing that had ever been in his control. The Massey Ferguson 362 turned 13,000 hours in the spring of 2016. Ed replaced the starter motor and rebuilt the front axle. 2 days of work. Parts cost $610. The machine ran as it had always run. The harvest of 2018 started well. October in Fountain County came in dry and cool, the kind of October that farmers remember as a gift, ground that held equipment without rutting, clear skies that let the days run long, corn that was dry enough to cut without excessive propane costs. Dennis Pruitt was in his fields by the second week of October with his John Deere combine. Gary Wills started his soybeans on October 11th. Ed was combining corn by October 9th, with a 3-day head start on most of his neighbors. On October 17th, at 6:40 in the morning, Gary Wills's combine stopped working. The feeder house chain had jumped its sprocket during the first pass of the day. The machine was down in the middle of a soybean field with weather coming, a system moving in from the west that the forecast was calling for rain by October 20th, possibly significant rain, the kind that could shut down harvest for a week or more in fields that hadn't dried back out sufficiently since the previous wet spell. Gary called his dealer. The dealer was backed up. It was October, and every combine within range had been running hard for 2 weeks. and the service schedule had no room for an emergency call before the following afternoon at the earliest. Gary called two neighboring farmers who ran the same brand. Both of them were in their own fields and couldn't stop. He called his son, who drove to the field and looked at it, and confirmed what Gary already knew, which was that without the right tools and the right parts, the machine wasn't moving. Gary had soybeans standing in the field. Rain was coming in 3 days. His combine was down, and his dealer couldn't come until tomorrow afternoon, at the earliest. And the repair, once the parts were sourced, could take another day on top of that. He stood at the edge of his soybean field and looked at the combine sitting motionless in the October morning and understood that he was going to lose days he didn't have. Then he did something that cost him more than he would ever say it cost him. He drove to Ed Calloway's farm. Ed was in his own field when Gary pulled up. He saw the truck from the cab of his combine and finished the pass he was on before stopping. He climbed down and walked to where Gary was standing at the field edge. Gary explained what had happened: the feeder house chain, the dealer's timeline, the weather forecast, the soybeans standing in the field. Ed listened without interrupting. When Gary finished, Ed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many acres you got left?" Gary said, 240. Ed said, "What kind of beans?" Gary told him the variety. Ed nodded. He looked at the sky. Then he looked at Gary. He said, "I've got 210 of my own corn left to cut. If I push through the next 2 days, I can have it done before the rain. After that, I'll bring my combine over and we'll cut your beans before the ground gets too soft." Gary said, "I'll pay you for the machine time." Ed said, "We'll work that out later." Ed said, "Go get your grain carts lined up. We're going to need them moving." That was the entirety of the conversation. No negotiation, no reference to auction yards or co-op comments or 2 decades of laughter at a fourth Massey Ferguson that an idiot overpaid for. Just 2 farmers in October, one of them with a problem and one of them with a solution. And the solution offered without conditions, because conditions in October when rain is coming are a luxury that neither of them could afford. Ed pushed his combine through the next 2 days with hours that started before sunrise and ended in the dark. Headlights on, running corn that was ready and ground that was still holding. He finished his corn on the evening of October 19th. The rain was coming the following afternoon. He drove his combine to Gary's field on the morning of October 20th, 4 hours before the first drops fell. They cut soybeans through the morning and into the afternoon, racing the weather, running as long as the conditions allowed. When the rain arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, they had 190 acres in the bin. 50 remained. The rain lasted 4 days. When the ground dried out enough to run equipment again, Ed brought his combine back. They finished Gary's soybeans on October 27th. The yield was good. The beans were in. Gary Wills stood at the field edge when the last load went to the grain cart. He looked at Ed's combine making its final pass. He looked at the cleared field. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I owe you." Ed said, "You don't owe me anything. It's harvest." Gary said, "I've been an ass to you for 20 years. Ed looked at him. Then he said, "Gary, I know what I bought in 1999. I knew it when I bought it. I didn't need you to know it too." Gary didn't have an answer for that. He shook Ed's hand and walked to his truck and drove home. Ed Calloway still farms 440 acres in Fountain County. The Massey Ferguson 362 that he bought in 1999 for $4,200 has 15,000 hours on it. He replaced the engine in 2021, a rebuild, not a replacement, done by a mechanic in Covington who had been working on Massey Ferguson equipment for 30 years, and who told Ed afterward that the block was the cleanest he'd seen at that hour count, and asked what Ed had been doing to it. Ed said he'd been changing the oil every 100 hours. The mechanic said that explained it. Dennis Pruitt sold his operation in 2020. The land went to a corporate farming entity. The equipment sold at auction for less than Dennis had hoped and more than some people expected. He moved to a smaller house in town. He doesn't farm anymore. Gary Wills is still farming. He downsized in 2019, selling 200 acres and reducing his equipment footprint to a scale that his income can support. without the debt structure that had been building since 2006. He runs a smaller operation now, more carefully, with a payment schedule that leaves room for a bad year without becoming a crisis. He bought a used Massey Ferguson in 2021, a 5711 with 4,000 hours, purchased from a dealer in Williamsport at a price that Gary told Ed, when he mentioned it at the elevator, he thought was fair. Ed said it sounded like a fair price. Gary said he'd been paying attention to how Ed maintained his equipment and had some questions about service intervals. Ed told him to come by the shed any time. Gary came by the following Saturday. They spent 2 hours going through the maintenance schedule. Ed showed him the spiral notebook he'd kept since 1994. Every service interval, every repair, every parts cost recorded in his handwriting across 27 years of Massey Ferguson operation. Gary looked through it without saying much. Then he said, "You've been doing this since the beginning." Ed said, "Since the beginning." Gary said, "I didn't know that." Ed said, "You didn't ask." The notebook is still on the shelf above the workbench. The Massey Ferguson 3362 is still in the shed. Ed starts it every spring the same way he's started it every spring for 22 years. Key in, throttle up, engine catching on the first or second turn, the sound of a diesel that has been maintained correctly settling into an idle that is unhurried and even and entirely without drama. In October of 1999, two men in an auction yard laughed at a $4,000 tractor that they had decided without inspection was not worth buying. The man who bought it drove it home and put it to work and kept it running for 19 years before the weather closed in and a neighbor's combine broke down, and the machine that had been laughed at became the machine that saved someone else's harvest. Ed Calloway did not remind anyone of that. He didn't need to. Gary Wills knew what he knew, and Dennis Pruitt was somewhere in town not farming anymore, and the Massey Ferguson 362 had 15,000 hours on it, and an engine that the mechanic in Covington said was the cleanest he'd seen. The laughter had been answered a long time ago. It just took 19 years for everyone involved to understand what the answer was.